so glad.
Would you like some water?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Steve Johnson. I'm the director of the Seawolf debate program at the University of Alaska Anchorage, and I am very proud to welcome you to this evening's debate, part of our Arguing Alaska debate series that the Seawolf debate program sponsors with the Alaska Dispatch News. The Arguing Alaska series is just one of the many projects that the Seawolf debate program takes on. We have a pretty extensive civic debating project that we pursue each year. That involves producing events like this, as well as hosting debates for middle school students and high school students, doing other public debates for civic groups around town. We run a big intramural debating tournament each fall on campus at the University of Alaska Anchorage. But one of the events that we're really proud of this year is the Debating Alaska's Fiscal Future contest. We partnered with Rasmussen Foundation and Atwood Foundation, as well as North Rim Bank and GCI, to offer $10,000 in scholarships to Alaskan high school and university students who are interested in making arguments for and against some of the controversial issues surrounding what we should do for Alaska's fiscal future. If you'd like more information about that, we've left some flyers on the tables. You can look around there and probably find one of those quarter sheets that'll give you some information about that. You can also visit our website for that contest. It is debatingakfuture.com. And we've got a whole bunch of information in there about how the contest works, how your students can enter. So please let people know that we're putting that on, and hopefully we'll get the next generation of Alaskans involved in the conversation about what their state will be for the future. But in addition to all of those civic projects that we take on, we also have a very strong competitive component to our debating program. Matter of fact, we just returned, quite literally, landed about 3 hours ago, from a tournament at Colorado College down in Colorado Springs. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about that if you let me brag for a second. At that tournament, there were 56 teams from colleges and universities all across the western U.S. We took 4 teams down there. After the preliminary rounds, all 4 of our teams had assembled records that were sufficient to advance them to the elimination round. So all 4 of our teams advanced. Feel free, some of them are here, give them a hand. But that's not even the best news. The best news is we brought home a whole passel of awards. In addition to having the top novice speaker at the tournament, which means that the next generation of Seawolf debaters is looking good already, we had a team win that tournament outright. So they competed in a final round against Air Force and I forget the other. The San Luis Obispo, Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, in a debate about whether or not President Obama should revoke the nomination of Merrick Garland to the Supreme Court. Very interesting debate. They did a really good job, but that was really an impressive showing for them because they completed what was a pretty rare feat for a debate team. They were the top-ranked team coming out of the preliminary rounds. They were ranked first and second speaker out of the 120-plus speakers that competed at the tournament, and they ultimately won the tournament in elimination round. So the hat trick in debate was a pretty rare thing for them. So congratulations to those students. We very much appreciate your support of our program and your coming here tonight. This is a fundraiser for our Seawolf debate program. I'll talk a little bit more about that as the evening moves on. But if you want to stay connected with us, there's a lot of good ways to do so. You probably were approached by some of our students if you were waiting in line prior to the theater opening. If you didn't get a chance to sign up with them, because they were offering people the opportunity to sign up for our mailing list, you can do so by visiting seawolfdebate.com and get on our mailing list there. You can also friend us on Facebook or like us on Instagram, or I don't know, somebody else runs that stuff for me, but there are lots of places on social media. Look for Seawolf Debate. We're pretty easy to find. We put out a lot of information about the events that we've got going on, and we'd certainly love to have you involved with the things that we're doing. Which brings us to tonight's debate. As a debate coach who's dedicated to improving students' ability to understand and argue both sides of any issue, I spend a lot of time conflicted in my personal views of what's right and wrong. Time spent articulating both sides of an argument or both sides of an issue has a way of doing that for you. Most often, this is a good thing. I think one of the virtues of academic debating is what I call the erasure of conviction. The ability to learn the other side's argument, to be required to articulate that argument, gives you a sensitivity to the other side's perspective that I think is valuable for students and unfortunately lacking in our world today. But some of these issues that we debate, and this one particularly tonight, hit closer to home than others. The movement that has come to be characterized as political correctness on university campuses is one of those issues. As I watch the videos from Mizzou and Yale and read about the stories from Occidental College and Oberlin, I became uncomfortable about what was happening in ways that I typically don't when I'm exploring current events issues. That probably makes sense. I've dedicated my career to safeguarding the ability of individuals to speak openly and freely, trusting in the marketplace of ideas to sort out the wheat from the chaff, particularly in our universities. But I'm also committed to that marketplace being inclusive of voices that traditionally haven't been permitted to transact the business of democracy, to see those voices whose message I firmly believe must be amplified to cut through the din of historic marginalization, seeming to demand that others be prevented from expressing their own thoughts, has produced in me a degree of discomfort that I'm kind of unfamiliar with. So as I often do, I turned to debate. So I'm very much looking forward to tonight's event to help me sort out some of these issues about whether or not political correctness is elevating respect and dignity for those people who must be included, or whether or not it compromises the free thought that we depend upon our universities to produce. The motion that we'll be debating tonight is political correctness has compromised free thought in American universities. And we're going to interrogate this motion in a debate organized into 3 phases. In the first phase, we'll allow each of our advocates a series of speeches to develop their cases for and against the proposition. We'll begin by hearing from the proposition, the pro side, and then alternate between the pro side and the con side until each of our 4 speakers has had one 8-minute opportunity to present their best case for or against the motion. Then in phase 2, we're going to open the floor to questions, exchanged between the teams, perhaps some questions from me, and also questions from the audience as well. In the final phase then, we'll provide each of our teams one 5-minute summary speech, during which they'll have the opportunity to wrap up their argument and get in the last possible word. You'll see on the screen behind me a poll. This poll is linked to a piece of software that allows you to text your opinion into that site, and it captures the audience sentiment before the debate begins. The way that we run our debates, our public debates, is that we take a measure of the audience's attitude before the debate begins. We then listen to the debate, have the broader discussion, and we return to a second poll at the end of the debate to let you again express your opinion based upon the arguments that you've heard. We then award the win to the team that causes the most change in attitude from the beginning to the end of the debate. So if you haven't yet done so, take out your cell phone, text your opinion to that number 37607, and one of those 3 codes over there on your left aligns with whether or not you agree with, disagree with, or are as of yet undecided about the motion. I'd also ask that once you've done that, you take a second to silence your cell phones, and we'll return to those at the end of the debate and give you one more chance to vote. Let me introduce the debaters for tonight's debate. Arguing that political correctness threatens free thought at American universities are Senator Mike Dunleavy and Paul Jenkins. Senator Dunleavy is a 2-term Republican senator from rural Mat-Su in the Copper River Valley in Whittier. He came to Alaska as a young man in the early 1980s from Pennsylvania and was an educator in rural western Alaska, including stints as a 5th to 12th grade teacher, principal, and superintendent for almost 20 years. He's been married to his wife, Rose, of 28 years, who was born and raised in the village of Noorvik. Senator Dunleavy, Rose, and their 3 daughters moved to the Mat-Su in 2004, where he has been an educator, school board president, and now senator. Senator Dunleavy enjoys reading, hanging out with his family, and anything outdoors, including hunting, fishing, and riding his horses and mules. His partner is Paul Jenkins. Paul has been a journalist for nearly 45 years, making his way from Florida to Alaska in 1990. Upon his arrival, he worked for the AP for 10 years, traveling the state covering stories, including the Exxon Valdez oil spill, for national and international distribution. In 1990, he became the editor of the Anchorage Times and continued to write opinion pieces and editorials for the Voice of the Times until 2008, when he created the Anchorage Daily Planet, an online news and opinion site featuring a conservative perspective on the events of the day. He continues to write for the Alaska Dispatch News, including a recent piece about political correctness on campus, in which he expressed concern about the threat that PC poses to the future of our country. Arguing against the motion are Doctors Diane Hirshberg and Dan Klein. Diane Hirshberg is a professor of education policy at UAA's Institute of Social and Economic Research and director of the Center for Alaska Education Policy Research. She also serves as advisor to the UAA Chancellor on Arctic Research and Education. Her research interests include educational policy analysis, indigenous education, circumpolar education issues, and school change. She studied the boarding school experience of indigenous students, teacher supply, demand, and turnover, including the costs of teacher turnover in Alaska, as well as school finance issues. She teaches courses in the UAA Honors College and the College of Education. She has a PhD in education from UCLA, a Master's of Public Administration from Columbia University, and a bachelor's degree from UC Berkeley. Her partner is Dr. Dan Klein. Dr. Klein is professor and director of English and director of general education at UAA. He specializes in medieval literature and culture, literary theory, religion and literature, and digital medievalism. And his former research concerns children violence and formal research concerns children violence and ethics in late medieval England. The work of Emmanuel Levinas and neo-medievalism and digital gaming. That's fascinating. He's published over 40 peer-reviewed articles and edited 4 anthologies on medieval topics, his latest being Digital Gaming Reimagines the Middle Ages, which examines how medieval characters, settings, and stories are refracted in contemporary digital games. He likewise writes about university teaching, the humanities and liberal arts, and U.S. higher education. Could you join me in giving all 4 of our advocates a big round of applause tonight? So this is your last chance to text in your opinion. If you haven't yet done so, take a look at those codes now. We're going to lock this poll up. We're going to listen to the debaters make their arguments for and against, and like I said earlier, we'll come back to that similar poll at the end of the debate. But at this point, I am pleased to call the House to order and to call upon our first speaker from the proposition side to speak on behalf of the motion, Senator Dunleavy.
Right down. Testing. Thank you for having us here this evening to talk about this very important issue, and I appreciate the folks that have come out on a busy evening. So the central question before us this evening is whether political correctness has a chilling effect on free thought on our college campuses. We believe that there should be no doubt that it does, and to go further, if this mindset becomes embedded, it will lead to less diversity, less open and free dialogue, and an Orwellian atmosphere that will challenge the underlying bedrock principles of our society. Before going further, let's first define what political correctness is. Webster defines political correctness as conforming to a belief that language and practices which could offend political sensibilities, as in matters of sex and race, should be eliminated. Cambridge defines it as disapproving of avoiding language or behavior that any particular group of people might feel is unkind or offensive. For example, the politically correct term for firefighter is used instead of fireman. Finally, the American Heritage Dictionary defines PC as conforming to a particular socio-political ideology or point of view, especially to a liberal point of view concerned with promoting tolerance and avoiding offenses in matters of race, class, gender, and sexual orientation. So basically, in layman's terms, be careful of what you say, when you say it, and to whom you say it to when on a college campus. But it doesn't end there. In reality, under these new and ever-changing social rules of dialogue and interaction, you don't even have to say anything. Sometimes your ethnicity, nationality, religion, sex, sexual orientation, or even body fat percentage can set someone off, and your very presence in a certain social setting could trigger something in someone for which you will be held responsible. For example, if you are a white person, or as some now say, a Caucasian American or European American, your very whiteness in certain settings can cause a reaction by individuals who self-identify with a minority group. This presence of a non-minority within and of itself can be viewed as a microaggression. It's a new term. A term used on campus to describe the subtle ways that racial, ethnic, gender, and other stereotypes can play out painfully for some in an increasingly diverse culture. Certainly something strange is happening in American colleges and universities. In the Atlantic magazine about a year ago, it was noted that a movement is arising, undirected and driven largely by students to scrub campuses clean of words, ideas, and subjects that might cause discomfort or give offense. Harvard professor Janine Salk wrote in an online article for The New Yorker about the law students asking her fellow professors at Harvard not to teach rape law, or, in one case, even use the word violate, as in violates the law, lest it cause students distress. Laura Capernis, a professor at Northwestern University, wrote an essay in the Chronicle of Higher Education describing a new campus politics of sexual paranoia, and was then subjected to a long investigation after students who were offended by this article and by a tweet she sent filed Title IX complaints against her. A professor protecting himself with a pseudonym wrote an essay for Vox describing how Gingerly now has to teach. In quotes, "I'm a liberal professor and my liberal students terrify me," the headline said. A number of popular comedians, including Chris Rock, have stopped performing on college campuses. Jerry Seinfeld and Bill Maher have publicly condemned the oversensitivity of students, saying too many of them can't take a joke. And it gets weirder. Let me highlight a few examples of what I'm talking about. Last year, a feminist studies professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara, assaulted a 16-year-old pro-life activist who was displaying literature on campus. The professor called the pro-life group members terrorists after she stole their poster displaying abortion images and then proceeded to assault one of the student activists. How about this one? This is one of my favorites. At Yale University, two professors, a husband and wife, both stepped down from their positions in May 2016. This came after students demanded they be removed for an email one of the professors sent to students. The email criticized the university administration for asking students to avoid wearing costumes that might be considered culturally insensitive for the holiday called Halloween. Another one of my favorites, you've all heard this one. Communications professor Melissa Click at the University of Missouri was fired after it was determined that she had inappropriate contact with a student, and what I mean by that is bumping into them, with a student reporter who was trying to film the protest on campus. Apparently, Professor Click did not care that she was violating the free speech rights of the student reporter. And by the way, she was a professor of communications at the University of Missouri. Now, and if you're a conservative speaker, forget it. Scripps College created a speaker series program designed to promote conservative opinion on campus, but Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist George Will was uninvited from a speaking engagement solely because of his conservative values. Ironic, huh? And one last one. The Rutgers Board of Governors unanimously invited Condoleezza Rice to be the 2014 commencement speaker. Well, critics at Rutgers believe that Dr. Rice, being a conservative and former member of the George W. Bush administration, effectively disqualified her from addressing the commencement ceremony. According to the faculty council resolution, which passed in opposition to Dr. Rice's invitation, a commencement speaker should embody moral authority and exemplary citizenship. Apparently, Dr. Rice failed on both of these accounts and was said to bring no positive merit. It's crazy, huh? This new climate is slowly being institutionalized and is affecting what can be said in the classroom, even as a basis for discussion. During the 2014-15 school year, for instance, the deans and department chairs of the 10 University of California system schools were presented by administrators at faculty learning training sessions with examples of microaggressions. The list of offensive statements included, "America is the land of opportunity," and "I believe the most qualified person should get the job." These were considered offensive statements. The current movement is largely about emotional well-being. It presumes an extraordinary fragility of the collegiate psyche, and therefore elevates the goal of protecting students from psychological harm. The ultimate aim, it seems, is to turn campuses into safe spaces, where young adults are shielded from the words and ideas that make someone comfortable. And more than the last, this movement seeks to punish anyone who interferes with that aim, even accidentally. You might call this impulse vindictive protectiveness. Famed attorney Alan Dershowitz, a longtime professor at Harvard Law, stated that colleges have become places where people are afraid of ideas. "I know when I speak on college campuses in favor of Israel, I need armed guards, protecting me from radical leftist students who use physical intimidation," he explained. Dershowitz said students today come into college thinking they know everything about race, gender, and other issues, and don't want to hear opposing points of view. He's absolutely right. While I don't always agree with him, President Obama got it right as well when he said a year ago at a college forum in Iowa, I've heard of some college campuses where they don't want to have guest speakers who are too conservative, or they don't want to read books if it has language that is offensive to African Americans, or somehow sends a demeaning signal to women. And I've got to tell you, I don't agree with that. And he's right as well. Finally, I think 1984 author George Orwell sums it up with regard to what needs to happen on our college campuses. If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they don't want to hear. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for that opening statement. We're now going to turn it over to our con side. I believe Dr. Hirshberg is going to take the first crack for the con side's arguments against the motion. Dr. Hirshberg.
Free speech and free thought as an underpinning of free speech is a concept I value dearly as a professor, as a researcher, and as someone who, as a student, engaged in activities that were thankfully protected by the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. So it is with all due respect for the concept of free speech that I argue today against the motion and instead contend that actions and activities lumped under the moniker of political correctness increase opportunities for free thought and open discourse at universities. But before I share my argument, I too want to talk about the meaning of the term political correctness itself. I adhere to a definition of political correctness that was used before the concept was appropriated by political extremists on either end of the spectrum. Politically correct means treating all humans with equal respect, regardless of race, gender, national origin, sexual orientation, religious belief, or other category. That, of course, is not the only definition of political correctness. The term has been used over the past few decades in both serious and tongue-in-cheek manners, sometimes to chide those who use language that harms or upsets without much consideration, and sometimes to try to foster discourse that allows participation by all. And sometimes the term is used in a literal manner for when language is accurate in describing political phenomena. Finally, it is now being used against those who try to give voice to the often silenced by tying the concept to behavior that shuts down discourse, which was never the intent. That's why it is so important to frame the concept correctly. There is a reason why the concept of political correctness became so prominent in the last few decades and why we are having this debate now on our campuses. For almost 2 centuries, the only voices that were privileged in our great nation were those of white males. And despite the gains of the last 6 decades, we still see enormous inequalities in terms of power and wealth. Whether you look at statistics on who is in elective office, who is at the helm of Fortune 500 companies, who enjoys multi-generational wealth, or by contrast, who is incarcerated, who experiences higher homicide rates, who drops out of school, and who commits suicide, it is clear we are far from creating a society in which the historically vulnerable or underprivileged are suddenly going to control the discourse and power in this nation. The term politically correct was used in the 1980s to recognize the ways in which the mainstream discourse discounted the views of women, ethnic, racial, and religious minorities, LGBTQ individuals, and others. But as the voices of these groups have become louder, it seems that there are those who view power and privilege as a zero-sum game, and they fear that they will lose their advantages. They believe that helping those with the least power find their voice will result in discrimination against those who come from privilege. And so the definition of political correctness has been co-opted by those who would stifle more free speech by silencing again those who have just started to be heard. We see this in our universities, which have become increasingly diverse, but which still embody many of the inequalities of the larger society. The students who come to our campus as first-generation students from economically vulnerable backgrounds, as ethnic, racial, or linguistic minorities, or gender non-conforming, typically have less success than those from white, middle, and upper-class backgrounds. And part of this is because they do not see themselves reflected in the professoriate or the curriculum, and they find themselves feeling that their perspectives are not welcomed. Many of these students are now challenging universities to incorporate their perspectives more intentionally and respectfully. And sometimes this leads to conflict, which is portrayed not as those who haven't been included trying to get their voices heard, but rather as attempts to shut out those from the mainstream. We have an obligation as institutions of higher learning, especially those of us from public institutions, to serve all students. But the lack of a common critical perspective about the history of higher education and privilege on the part of faculty, students, and administrators makes this worse. It is why we need political correctness as a framework to foster productive dialogues rather than shut them down. So how is it that political correctness leads to increased free thought and free speech rather than stifling them? First, PC means treating with respect those with whom you disagree, and even those whose behavior or stances you find reprehensible. It doesn't mean shutting down free speech by those with unpopular views, as my opponents would have you believe. Indeed, PC means instead that instead of disinviting a speaker with whom you disagree or shouting them off the stage, as did happen, unfortunately, when I was an undergraduate, students engage with that person to present a counter-argument. It means allowing demonstrators to express their opposition to the views of a speaker, but not allowing them to shut down that speaker. It means helping those who wish to oppose a particular view to do so in a constructive and evidence-based fashion, presenting arguments that, if done well, often can't be answered by those who state opinions based on ideology instead of fact. PC does not mean that we protect others from difficult conversations or unpleasant topics, but it does mean that we engage in these discussions in respectful ways that allow those whose voices have too often not been heard to share their thoughts. But to do that well, we must scaffold students and give them places to explore difficult issues without being made to feel unwelcome or unsafe. Students need to learn how to express themselves, how to debate controversial topics, and how to attack ideas without attacking each other. Safe spaces do not have to prevent students from ever hearing difficult or oppositional thoughts. Rather, they need to foster exploration of controversial concepts and the crafting of arguments without the fear of being shot down before they ever get started. This can benefit students from all political and social perspectives. It is true that some universities have taken the concept of protecting vulnerable populations too far. You've heard from my opponent about trigger warnings, where faculty are asked to warn students about content in courses or readings that may upset them. While it is appropriate for instructors to guide students in making sense of difficult topics and to create spaces where students can share if materials do upset them, censorship via trigger warnings is not okay, and political correctness has never been intended as a vehicle for censorship. The right has typically lumped trigger warnings under the politically correct moniker, but trigger warnings are not some sort of requirement for political correctness in higher education. Indeed, our own professional association, the American Association of University Professors, discourages trigger warnings. AAUP notes some discomfort is inevitable in classrooms if the goal is to expose students to new ideas, have them question beliefs they have taken for granted, grapple with ethical problems they have never considered, and more generally expand their horizons so as to become informed and responsible democratic citizens. The responsibility of the university is to enable students to engage in this process thoughtfully. At UAA, we actively challenge students and faculty to engage in what we call difficult dialogues. It is PC to introduce controversial topics into the classroom in ways that build the skills of students and professors for addressing them effectively and productively. And so while some universities have gone too far in trying to control disputes or conflicts, most have not. Indeed, arguing that political correctness has led to the end of free thought or free speech on college campuses is like arguing that all Republicans are guilty of sexual harassment because of the actions of one prominent candidate. James Wagner, when he was president of Emory University, wrote, "As an academic community, which we must value and encourage the expression of ideas, vigorous debate, speech, dissent, and protest. At the same time, our commitment to respect, civility, and inclusion calls us to provide a safe environment that inspires and supports courageous inquiry. Political correctness means exactly that, creating a safe environment in which courageous inquiry leads to free speech and thought and the embodiment of a civil society far more inclusive and democratic than our founding fathers could ever imagine."
Well, I want to say thank you to both first speakers from each side for laying out their cases. Unsurprisingly, we have some disagreement about what political correctness is and how expansively we should consider that concept. Let's turn now to our second speakers from each side. Speaking first in the second speaking position will be will be Paul.
Man, you're tall. Good evening. I have my own definition of political correctness. It's the toleration of intolerance. It's been with us since Aristotle, who had no use for rhetoric. It's worked its way down through history, adopted by governments, universities, anyone who wants to shut off debate or take control of the issue. The controlling the language and you control the issue is something that control the narrative. It's something that people who want to squelch freedom understand easily. And it takes now, as you pointed out, we have examples that are so incredible in even our emergent society. James Madison University, imagine that, the irony is palpable, spit out a 35 dumb expressions guide to incoming freshmen. Tell them what not to say. Number 3, I don't think of you as. Number 4, the same thing happens to me too. Number 9, you're so articulate. Number 16, I never owned slaves. Really? My very favorite, of course, referring to older people. It's cute. I don't have a problem with that. What we have is on campuses, we have students interacting with administrations deciding to dodge political pressure from legislatures, for instance. There was a university on the East Coast. There was going to be a class on how to be a lesbian in 10 days. The legislature decided that may not be the best idea, so school administrators shut that down. There are examples of this increasingly across the country, where politicians lean on the schools to stifle speech. Then we have the students. We have students who, in 1980, were worried about speech codes and multiculturalism. And now today, we've got trigger warnings and microaggression. And trigger warnings are nothing more than the not wanting to hear the other side of the story. That's pretty much it. No, I'm done. We're not talking now. The microaggressions can be anything. Doesn't promote a safe feeling in school. Having read the other side of this and looked at it, I can see how that might. But when you let government decide what will and will not be said in a university, especially a state university that is protected by the First Amendment, or even a private university, which survives based on its claims of academic freedom or excellence, you have a problem. We have entertainers not being allowed on campus, political speakers not being allowed on campus. Where does it stop? Government or institutions should not, in the pursuit of academic excellence, shut off speech in any way. It's a tough world. You have to wear a cup. And if you're not happy where you are, try to understand why. My wife, God bless her, refers to the generation that we're talking about in this as the snowflake generation. I'm starting to think she's right. If you can't be insulted, then don't be there. Everywhere you go on the planet, somebody's going to have something to say you're not going to want to hear. But every now and then, when you listen, you learn. And that's what these institutions are for, learning. So I guess I'm to the point where you have to, the Atlantic magazine, you can go down the list, example after example after example. Speech being cut off, speakers being run off. Atlantic magazine calls it the new intolerance of student activism. I think it's more than that. I think it's a new turn in the American society where we have a certain group that, by golly, is going to control the thought processes of another group. To do that, you have to control the speech. And when that happens, this will be 1984. Thank you very much.
Appreciation to the pro side for those comments. We'll turn now to our last con speaker, Dr. Klein, to wrap up our preliminary phase of the debate. Dr. Klein.
I've been triggered. My feelings have been hurt. I think what surprises me is honestly how much I agree with the two folks who are on the other side of the issue. The situations that Senator Dunleavy outlined are, I think, beyond the pale. A number of the actions that have been gathering steam in the public media are things that I think we do need to be concerned about. But I also think we need to understand that I think in every one of those cases, there was more speech and there was pushback, and the worst cases did not follow through. And the law and the courts and others have taken their rightful place. So if folks on one side of an issue assault someone on the other side, right, those people get in trouble. When people are disinvited, there's consequences. There's more speech. There's not the closing down of speech, but there's more speech. Sometimes it's fractious, sometimes it's not very tolerant, but there's been more speech. So let me just touch on a couple of issues that we've already looked at, and then I want to kind of wrap it up by reframing the conversation just a bit. Trigger warnings. This is difficult. Did you know that UAA has one of the highest populations of veterans anywhere in the US? About 18%. Now, the way trigger warnings have been portrayed by these student activists, it's been portrayed as we don't want to have to study things that would hurt our feelings. Now, that's probably true for some folks. But do you know someone who's been physically abused systematically over a long term? Do you know someone who's returned from Iraq or Afghanistan who wakes up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat? Do you know someone who's on medication because of panic attacks, because of something that's happened in their lives? When I have students coming into my classroom, I have 30 students, I don't know their lives, I don't know their histories. But UAA takes everybody. And it's my responsibility to bring those students from where they are to the place where they can move on to the next stage in their journey. So I'm prevented in talking to the parents of students who have been triggered, but I still get the phone calls. And one phone call was from the mother of a returned Iraq vet who read something in class, caused a relapse of his PTSD symptoms. He was absent for 2 weeks, and she wanted to know, how can we get him back in the classroom? I couldn't have known that, right? I don't know what's going to trigger somebody. So a term that some people are using now is content warnings. You don't put them on a syllabus, you just say, gosh, we're going to be talking about some tough issues here. This is college, and we'll find ways to work through it. So trigger warnings. Second, safe spaces. I think Diane made a really good case that, again, UAA, did you see this week at the ADN, there are more than 100 languages spoken in the Anchorage School District. We are the most diverse city in the US. UAA, we take them all. We take them all. And many of those folks have never had a voice. They've never had a voice. And so UAA has a program that faculty can volunteer for called Safe Space. It's just a way of being welcoming to all different perspectives, conservative as well, right? And so folks can feel like they have an ally, someone on the faculty that they can talk to about the transitions they're going through. Those of you who've been to college, it's a weird time, right? One day, I want to be a nurse. It's the greatest thing in the world. No, the next day, Marxism. Oh my gosh, this is great. Sociology. Oh. You can build castles in one day and destroy them the next and move on to the next thing. That's the way it should be. And if people get a little bit hinky, a little bit crossways, even a little bit nasty, I think that's okay. And it goes on both sides of the aisle, doesn't it? It's not just either or. There's a lot of diversity here. And I would just say that on the more conservative side of the aisle, there have been safe spaces for generations. We just call them private schools. A lot of folks don't have the ability to do that. Third thing, disinvitations. Yeah, I don't like that. I wouldn't not invite somebody because I didn't agree with their politics. At the same time, I would say this is one that's a little bit closer for me. Do I invite a young Earth creationist to lecture in a biology classroom? Do I invite an alt-right anti-Semite to have space on campus? Do I bring in a Holocaust denier simply because it would be giving free speech to someone? I think universities do have a responsibility to weigh these things carefully. But disinviting simply because someone has an unpopular political opinion, I can't go with that. Okay, so those are those three issues. Let me move on real quickly. Political correctness, whose politics, which correctness? And this is the point I want to leave, and one that I teach. There is no such thing as innocent language, and I think we heard that from the other side. All language is loaded, right? If you control the language, you can control the narrative. Take these two. Refugee, immigrant. Anchor baby, American citizen. Did the Supreme Court give homosexuals the right to marry? Or did the Supreme Court recognize the right of gay couples to marry? Right? This is why I study literature, because people live and die every day on the interpretation of words. This is crucial, it's important. Finally, yeah, a lot here, but I just want to make one comment to our moderator. We're going to vote, right?
Eventually.
I'm not going to recognize unless I win.
I should have anticipated that that would come up at some point in the debate. That was my fault.
Bad hombre.
So you are one bad hombre, Dr. Klein. So we've had a chance to get a sense of what the arguments are for and against. We're going to move on now to the second phase of our debate, where we have a chance to talk between the teams, between myself and some of the advocates that we've heard here today, and eventually from you all. So as we're having some discussion and some exchange between these two teams, start thinking about what questions you have about this subject, perhaps in response to some of the arguments that were made, perhaps questions that you had coming in that have not yet been answered. We'll get to those in just a little bit, but I want to start by asking a question that I've been thinking about for each team, a different one for each team, but something that's been on my mind as we hear this. So first of all, to the pro side, if you guys could grab that microphone and make sure that you're ready to go. Both of you mentioned language and the policing of language as being an important issue, and one that causes you concern. Senator Dunleavy, you mentioned the difference between firefighters and firemen. Mr. Jenkins, you mentioned the admonition that people not use the word cute as an example of this language policing that you're concerned with. We heard just from the con side about the importance and the value of language. Last year, the name of the highest peak on the North American continent was changed from McKinley, which was originally given it in order to honor a president who never set foot in Alaska, to Denali, which is the Koyukon Athabascan name for the peak. Barrow just recently changed their city's name to Utqiagvik, which is the traditional name for that territory. Aren't these examples of political correctness right here in Alaska? And if they are, do you support them?
That's a good question. So, for example, I don't know how to say this now, because this is what part of the problem is with this issue. You now start to have to retrain your mind and anticipate what people may think you're saying or what you mean. I'll give you an example. So I spent 20 years in rural Alaska, and I met a wonderful woman who happened to be, as of up until April of last year, and in a law that the president signed, some folks would have considered her to be Eskimo. I can't use that term. I can't use that term anymore. We joke around at the house. My wife is a native Alaskan. She is an Inupiaq Eskimo for the village of Norvik. Grew up and lived there. My kids are half Eskimo. There's a place out in Antioch, for example. Do you know what the mascot of their team is? Anyone know? The half-breeds. I didn't call them the half-breeds. They named themselves the half-breeds. And when the issue swept the country a couple years ago about changing the names of mascots, those kids stood up and said, don't tell us what to think. Don't tell us what we are. We make that decision. And so with regard to changing names and so forth, I think we're all going to be a little off balance here, and I don't know who is going to be able to keep up with some of these things. Hate to say this for some, I still refer to my wife as an Eskimo because she does. She says she's not Inuit. She's not from Canada. And regardless of what the president did or what some colleges will do in terms of terminology and words, there will be some folks that still refer to place names or individuals or concepts like they always have. And not because they want to do this to be mean or insensitive. But sometimes those words really did convey the real meaning. And they continue to use the meaning. So to be honest with you, I go back and forth between Denali and McKinley. I don't even think about it sometimes. I came up in '83, it was Mount McKinley. The park and preserve was Denali. So I'll probably still do that. And I'm not doing it because I want to stick it to somebody or you know, as they say, use my white privilege to drive people nuts. But you know, it must be that it just must be that public education that I had because I never really did go to private school like some others have. So anyway.
So this question of privilege, I think, is interesting. It actually kind of frames the question that I wanted to pose to the con side. So this notion that there have been voices traditionally marginalized and voices that have traditionally been privileged in our public discourse, I think is a very critical issue to this question of what we should do, how we should talk, how we should behave, and how we communicate inclusion, respect, etc. David Duke, a leader of the Ku Klux Klan, probably all familiar with him. He's currently polling high enough in the Louisiana Senate race to have qualified to be included in a televised candidate debate on November 2nd. That debate is scheduled to be hosted by Dillard College, a historically black college. If Dillard College can find their way to host a debate featuring David Duke, why can't Rutgers host Condoleezza Rice?
Well, I believe this gets to my point that there are universities that have taken notions too far. And it's a growth pattern because like I said, I was an undergraduate at Berkeley when and I was not in the room, but when my classmates shouted Jean Kirkpatrick off the stage. And that is not the way to educate people around discourse. It is why we have difficult dialogues, which started as a project around encountering Muslims, which, my goodness, we need to be having that exact project right now in our national political dialogue, because it's how do you actually learn how to listen to somebody who you disagree with and use again, it's an argument that's based in fact. So I'm a social scientist, and one of the hallmarks of being a social scientist is bringing evidence to bear on problems and on phenomena and issues we're dealing with. I am shocked and horrified by what has happened in discourse, not just on our campuses, but in our political realm right now. The amount of rumor and hearsay, and it is. So it's starting to hit our students, and it's hitting our students at the university level and at K-12. And what we have to be doing is saying, no, you actually have to engage respectfully. And it's okay to look at David Duke and say, you are wrong. Here's how your language is wrong. Here's how your views are wrong. Here's the evidence of how it's wrong. And you've got to equip students. And that does mean, in some cases, you're going to take a student outside, you're going to hug them, you're going to hold them, because they're going to be crying, because this is horrible and painful. But then we're going to figure out how we come back in and engage. And I think that's the missing piece when people start to say that trigger warnings and safe spaces and all of these are just automatically about shutting down free speech. No, it's about how do you create free speech by creating a way that somebody can engage who is threatened by that very person with whom they're trying to engage.
Okay, yeah, so Dr. Klein, I want to hear you on this particularly because you had mentioned hosting anti-Semites on campus or inviting creationists to a biology class that focuses on evolution. Do you think that Dillard would be within their rights to opt out of hosting David Duke in that debate?
No, I think institutions should also have the right to say yes or no to folks who are invited. But I think it's also short-sighted. I guess, not that this turns into too much of a love fest up here that we're all sort of agreeing about a lot of these things. I think we are. But I tend to be kind of an old-fashioned civil libertarian about this, right? So give a fool a podium. And not to speak of any of my, but here I am, so, you know, I study medievalism and gaming, so what am I doing up here? You know, this is one of a number of things. So, no, I think that institutions, and especially with private institutions, right, we usually allow a little bit more leeway. But I think as educators, I would chime in with Diane, and I think I heard some of the same sentiments, that it's our responsibility not to avoid difficult issues, but to work through them, and to have the respect to say, you know, I just think you're dead wrong. You're just dead wrong, and here are the reasons why. Not because you're ugly or because you're cute or what, you know, not the ad hominem stuff, but yeah. Well, and of course here are four white folk talking about, you know, other people and all those kinds. I just wanted to note that irony as well. But I also think that that context is important. So we had a situation at UAA a few years back where a number of fundamentalist Christian students in the College of Ed in a teaching science course tried to take over the classroom in the discussion. Right? So there you have a different kind of situation. So what is our responsibility as educators? Now, if you're a young earth creationist, that's great. You may have good reasons for that. However, it's not science, and it's not what should happen in a science classroom, right? So there are distinctions that we have to make as educators, but to avoid the issue is not the thing. To shout down the opposition is not the thing. It's to work through those issues with one another, and that's really, I think, what the role of an educator is.
All right. Well, I also want to give the teams a chance to ask some questions of each other. So you've had a chance now to hear 16 minutes of argument from either side. I'm guessing there's got to be some questions that are burning that you would like the other team to answer or pose challenges to them. I'll extend the opportunity to the pro side first. Would you like to ask a question of the opposition side, of the con side, so that they could have a chance to respond?
Well, I guess it's really, it is a question, just to verify. So it seems like, as you mentioned, we're kind of on the same page. I think we all agree that you need this discourse. That's what a university is all about. You need these discussions and so forth. When looking at, and I'll be very brief, but when looking at the central question, and the central question is whether political correctness has a chilling effect, do you think there are enough examples for those that have gone on to YouTube or have read it in the paper or as a matter of fact, take this down, folks. There's a website called The Demands. If you have a phone, go to it now. You'll be amazed. But the question I have is, do you think some of this stuff is just spinning out of control?
All right, a legitimate question. Has PC gone too far?
Go ahead.
Right. Well, I guess what I would say is I agree that that we have a problem with people shutting down discourse, that has gone too far. My concern is that the concept, the term political correctness has become what we've lumped bad behavior under. That, as one of those, I mentioned Berkeley undergraduates who used to go around talking about, well, that isn't very PC, is it? That term, that concept was not about shutting things down. It was about calling out people who were engaging in behavior that shut people down. And so, and one of the things when you look at the history of PC is the meaning has changed multiple times over the years. I mean, it's, in some cases, some very frightening people were using that term in the 30s and 40s. So, it is how do you define this? And I think we agree that we're all trying to come to terms with how we use words to foster free speech that is informed and not abusive. And so I look at PC as a way of moving toward that rather than away from that.
All right.
Yeah. So again, I'm an English professor, but here's some data. I'm learning to love data. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, in 2013, they were a couple years behind, there were 7,253 post-secondary institutions in the U.S. that were Title IV eligible, that is, for federal student loans. About 20 million students. The examples are egregious, they're difficult, they're high profile, they get a lot of press. Is that really an accurate representation of what goes on in the classroom? Now, I think we have to make a bit of a distinction because very few of the things that have been cited here are about actual classroom interactions. They're public protests, they're demonstrations, they're high profile sorts of things. But I would say that what goes on in classrooms across the US is a great diversity, a great variety of conversations. And you know, when I have a group of students, we've got 15 weeks together, twice a week, and we go through all kinds of ups and downs. And in fact, that's really what the beauty of this is. So let's keep a bit of perspective on this. There are always horror stories, right? But I think in the big picture, it's not quite as dramatic. The second thing I would say is, lots of things I would say, but.
We do want to move on to other questions
well,
too,
maybe.
so if you feel like you've hit the point, it's always a good thing to keep in mind. Let me do this.
He just closed me down.
Is that a microaggression?
let me compensate by offering you again the opportunity. Certainly there are questions that you have for the proposition, for the pro side. Here's your chance now to pose a question to them.
Yeah, and you know, in the spirit of actually sort of solving problems, and I would ask Paul and Mike, if you could do one thing, if you had free reign to do one thing, or communicate one thing to faculty, to educators, to what would you ask for folks like me and Diane who are in the classroom and who work at the administrative levels and maybe can help move the needle? What would help sort of tamp down this furor?
Okay, so given the concerns that you've expressed about the climate in academia, if you could change one thing, or maybe even highlight one thing, elevate one thing, what would it be?
So appreciate that. So a lot of this stuff that we're talking about today, especially the negative aspect of it, remember now the question was, and it's morphed a little bit, but whether political correctness has a chilling effect on free thought. It depends on how it's used again. It depends on how it's approached by certain individuals, certain groups, certain universities, certain professors, certainly. And I think what we're saying tonight together is there's a way of having a dialogue on political correctness, which when I say doesn't offend people, I mean the intent is not to shut them up, shut them down, and not have them express what they're really thinking or their freedom. If there was one thing I would suggest, and I'm a graduate from the University of Alaska, a master's in cross-cultural studies. I know for some this whole being married to a native living in rural Alaska, being an educator, conservative Republican thing doesn't kind of mesh, but anyone that wants to have a dialogue about that, I'll have that with you. But what I would simply ask is, I'm pretty much a libertarian when it comes to, I think the most important thing in this country, and I mentioned in the speech, is this. We're the freest society on the face of the earth because we are free, and we are free to talk and ask questions and to question things, and we're free to stumble into things. For example, being married to my wife of 28 years, you know, I'd have to take all night long to explain to you how she has helped me when we lived up in that culture and how she's helped me when certain things I've said as an East Coast tall white guy have maybe not gone well. Certainly it's never been my intent, but the point I'm trying to make is if there was one thing I would say to you is you really need to tell you really want to enforce with your colleagues and students There should be nothing off the table because that's how you learn, and that's what universities are all about. You should not be afraid to be afraid, okay? You should not be. Because in the end, and I'll end with this, in the end, if you want to see the logical conclusion of some of this radical stuff that we both agree should not be happening, look at a university in North Korea. Where is the diversity there? Where is the independent thought there? We have more Pulitzer Prize winners, what is the guy's name?
Nobel.
Thank you, Nobel. I was just thinking Pulitzer. Nobel Prize winners in this country, not because we all think the same, not because we don't question, it's because we do the opposite. That's how you discover new things. And I think that's the only thing I would suggest, is for professors and students to understand that you have to have these discussions, or you run the risk of not learning new things, and you run the risk of basically coming into the university and leaving it with a degree with really not learning much.
Apparently a very good answer. You got your opposition to clap for you. That's impressive. So we're going to do this now. We're going to give you a chance to be part of the debate. We're going to, first of all, I'd like to ask, I've got a couple of students standing by who are going to come up and grab the microphones off our speakers' podiums here. And they're going to be working the aisles to give you a chance to ask some questions of the teams. But I want to give a couple of, I won't call them rules because I don't want to oppress or suppress your right to free speech, but I will call them strong suggestions. The first is that this is really confusing. This portion of the debate is often really confusing for some people because they think what I'm inviting them to do is to give a long speech. I'm not. And the way that you can tell, if you're still confused even after that, the way that you can tell that I'm not inviting you to give a speech is that you're not up here on the stage, okay? So understand that when I'm giving you the opportunity to ask a question, I would like you to phrase a question. If you can't imagine a question mark at the end of what it is you're saying, or your voice doesn't reach an upward inflection at the end of your statement, you're probably not asking a question. Here's another way to think about it. Ask a question that would change your mind, right? Direct it at one of the teams. If you side with the proposition side, and you're suspicious of what the con side is saying, ask them the question that causes you to be suspicious and give them the chance to change your mind. So, with that said, and with the full guarantee that I will cut you off if you go on too long, do we have somebody who's interested in asking a question of either side or perhaps raising a question to both of the teams? I can't see you very well, so speak up, let us know who you are. If you guys would work up the aisle, maybe you'll find some people who are interested in asking a question. There we go. Would you start, please, by letting us know who you are?
Hi. Whoa. I'm God. No. I'm Shelley. And my question is for Representative Dunleavy. Senator Dunleavy. I demoted you, sorry. And Mr. Jenkins. My question is where do you draw the distinction between being politically correct and hate speech? Where is that distinction drawn for you, and how do you think that as students, particularly since we're talking about universities who are in the classroom, when do you think they should have to listen to hate speech? So I guess it's a two-parter.
This is a terrific question. So hateful speech, of course, is designed to hurt, to offend, to derogate those? How do you draw the line?
You just answered it. I think it's intent. I think it's what is your intent? Again, I'll use the example. When I refer to my wife in certain settings and in certain conversations, and she does as well, as Eskimo, some people nowadays, especially after the order was given by the president that we no longer use that, will become offended over time. The intent, though, is not to offend someone in that context. By the same token, if I'm walking down the street or there's students in class and I walk in there and there's a number of African American students and I use the N-word, clearly the purpose of that is to denigrate or offend. The danger of what we're talking about here is stumbling into the unknown. I mean, literally, I might go into a room where there's a number of minority students, and they may say that I've triggered some type of macroaggression or microaggression because of my white privilege that I was never even aware of until I studied this topic for this debate. And so I think intent is the key. intent is the key. And I think the other side needs to be just as understanding. And like I said, 28 years being married to somebody from a totally different culture, totally different background, totally different part of the continent, working together, and trust me, like a lot of marriages, there's been some questions here and there, but working through that, the intent is to have a positive relationship and learn from that person. If that's the case, I think it's not hateful, and it's the intent is, I think, key to everything.
All right, excellent. Do we have another question from someone out there in our audience? Again, I can't see you, so you're going to have to speak up. There we go, right there. Let us know who you are.
My name is Steve Haycox. I taught for 40 years full-time at the University of Alaska, Anchorage. I have just a very brief comment. I hope Senator Dunleavy and Mr. Jenkins, you don't believe that there is a great deal of compromising of free thought at this university as a result of political correctness. That would not be my experience, nor do I think it would be the experience of many other faculty, as Professor Klein suggested. Diane, this question is aimed primarily at all of the panel, but it will hit you harder. Should a university, this university, schedule, and then by implication sanction, a course in the history of the women's rights movement and feminism in American culture, taught by a male professor?
Okay, an interesting question about perspective and privilege, ownership and authority.
Yeah, what about that?
That's a really good question. And I am somebody who has stumbled at times in the work that I do, which has to do with race, ethnicity, work on Indigenous education, in my advocacy work, my faculty governance work. And so this does hit home, because there are times when, for instance, when I was studying, working on my doctorate, and I was trying to understand how non-Indigenous policymakers were making decisions about Alaska Native education. There were a lot of people who were very happy to see a white person deconstructing white people, but there were other people who were still concerned about what is this white chick from outside at the time doing looking at Alaska Native education. And so I think there are questions about this, but one, I believe that men can be feminists. I think I'm married to one. Two, I don't believe that academic content is owned by anybody. Now, I do understand there have been universities where students have demonstrated, because if there is a qualified woman to teach a women's studies class and you're giving it to a man, why is that the case? On the other hand, I really do think that, for better or for worse, we teach the history of people who are different than us all the time. I try to find a history class at UAA that is not taught. I guess we have a couple of faculty that are not all white, but we have a lot of people that are teaching histories of people other than themselves. Hopefully what they've done is consulted the right literature. Hopefully they have been humble in saying that this is not my experience, but I'm going to do my best to help you as a student unpack and understand these experiences of other people and what this history has meant. So I would certainly allow a university to have a male teach a women's rights movement and feminism course if that person was truly qualified and taking a stance, and there wasn't a woman who was more qualified to teach it.
Can I push on that question just
Yes.
a little bit? And maybe, Dan, you could answer with your perspective, but just let me phrase this. You mentioned the notion of qualified, right? So a hypothetical. Assume two perfectly and equally qualified candidates. Is there either an imperative that the female professor teach, or is it equally appropriate to have either of them teach if they are both perfectly and equally qualified?
I don't think there's I'm going to get in trouble. I don't think there's actually an imperative. If you're saying equally qualified, this means that they are grounded in the theory and in the philosophies they should be able to, I guess that's also this notion that feminism only belongs to women, and I know this is this conversation we have a lot when we're studying race, that racism is something that sort of is what white people have, and there are other kinds of isms that other people have, and I think that's a really important conversation to have, and perhaps maybe that's part of how a professor who's male teaching this content has to start, by bringing students into that critique and challenging them to challenge him. But that can be done well. And I was going to say, in some cases, if you're at Bryn Mawr and 80% of the faculty are female, and you have a qualified male scholar of feminism, wow, what a chance for students to engage in a different perspective than what they had expected to engage in that content area.
Fair enough. Dr. Klein, please, by all means.
I always get excited when I have something to say about these issues. So I actually teach, as a white male, I actually teach a medieval women's writing course. And people say, you mean women work? Yes. In fact, there's a lot of it. Just to come back to the issue, if there are other folks who are qualified, in fact, I've traded off a medieval course with another colleague, and she teaches some of the same content. And so I would not want to get into this sort of thing that you have to have some sort of a kind of personal experience in order to teach, because then we end up with silence, right? Who can really talk about anything other than their own experience? And I don't even know what's going on in my own head half the time, let alone what is going on in someone else's head. By the same token, we don't need to allow that to be an excuse for qualified folks who have been underrepresented to come in and to be able to teach. So I think that's really important. The other piece here, this is something we face in the university, student evaluations, right? So how do we separate out students liking what's happening versus what they learn? Now, of course, we would like students to like what's happening, but they don't have to like it in order to learn something important. And so one of the other things that college does, I think ideally, is that you learn how to learn from a lot of different people in a lot of different situations who have very different kinds of strengths. Some of the best experiences I've ever had, and maybe you can think about this yourself, are with people that would otherwise be considered boring, right? A lecture that's sort of droned on. But when that person is brilliant, right, and they really know their field, it takes work for a student to listen and to learn, and we have to be able to learn to do those different things. The other thing I wanted to say in response to Senator Dunleavy is, honestly, I think we need to remember that people do have a right to feel offended. It's okay if you're offended, right? If I say something, you don't like it, you can feel bad about it. It's okay. I have licensed you to feel that, by the way, so you can feel bad if I say something. But yeah, so let's not confuse those things, right? It's what you do with it. And that's why in my classes, I actually push against this idea of intent. Because you can intend all kinds of things, but what comes out is what you really should be responsible for, right? So.
All right, we have a little more time. Are there more questions out there from folks who would like to pose some questions to the debaters? We've got one right down here. Again, if you'd let us know who you are.
Hi, my name is Raj. I have a question for the con side. So I'm a foreign national. I didn't know how to speak English when I first came to this country. We didn't have political correctness in our language. So when I first moved here, I didn't understand, because to me, English is a very black and white language. I was interacting with this African-American student, and instead of calling him an African-American student, I called him, hey, you're black, I'm brown, he's white. And he got really offended. So for a foreign national, how would you suggest that they navigate the political correctness?
All right,
in the American
a good question. Very well contextualized. Response to that from our con-side debaters?
Well, I wish I could say that your experience was unique because you were an immigrant, but I think, and as the senator was saying, this is something that we are all trying to understand. And in fact, one of the powerful activities I've been involved with it's called Endore, the Alaska Native Dialogues on Racial Equity, which First Alaskans Institute has. And what they've been trying to do is structure conversations. So this is not about big learning opportunities, although they just did this huge thing with the school district, but mostly it's about smaller conversations where safe spaces to engage in difficult conversations are created. It may be 5 people that you know from your softball team. It may be your parents, which sometimes are the hardest people to have this conversation with. But it's structured to have some questions about often what was the first time you experienced some kind of discrimination, because it does not matter who you are, it does not matter how white and privileged you are. You have experienced at some point something where you have felt stomped on in some way, or you've witnessed it. You've had that experience. For me, it was, I always think back on when I was in the South as a 13-year-old, and there were a group of white boys that I was traveling with who were talking to a group of African-American boys, and I walked over and opened my mouth, and the black kids looked at me and said, "White girls don't talk to us." And it was that stunning realization that my little fairy tale world that I was from wasn't what other people were living. And so it's having those hard conversations. Unfortunately, the biases that we all carry biases. It's just part of who we are in terms of trying to make it through the world. We classify things. We have to find ways to respectfully hear other people, their experiences, share our experiences, and come to common understandings. And we're losing that. We are losing that ability to have the respectful discourse and to say, oh my God, you don't want to place on somebody, oh, you're Native, so you need to explain to me how all Natives think about something. That's completely the wrong way to do it, and that happens all the time to my Indigenous students. On the other hand, a one-on-one conversation where tell me about where you grew up and what it was like, and then I tell you about where I grew up, and we start having that conversation about, wow, I had no idea that was that similar, that Jewish burials rituals and Chupik burial rituals are actually kind of similar. That level, so you're not speaking for all Native people, I'm not speaking for all Jews, but we're having a conversation that brings us to an understanding of how we look at the world. That's what we have to move toward.
Okay. I'm going to build on this. I want to definitely give the pro side a crack at this question, but Senator Dunleavy, you particularly mentioned this notion of intent, and here's an example that we just got in this question where the intent was entirely innocent, naive even, given that this person came from a different culture, a different country. Does the person who was offended by that have a right to that offense? Do they have the ability then to build upon that right by demanding that the person who has offended them not do so?
Well, first of all, I'd like to just briefly comment on what Diane said. I have been offended, especially in Juneau, with some of my Democratic colleagues down there. But anyway, it's just part of the business. And some of my liberal Republican friends as well. I think, I think it's, so when I lived in rural Alaska for 20 years, I first went up to a very small village where I still have many friends. First time off the plane, I was a minority, first time in my life. I came from Scranton, Pennsylvania, which was all white. I mean, all white. East Coast. To a native village, 100 miles from Nome, 100 some miles from Nome, 500 miles from the nearest road. Long story short, immediately I was thrust into an environment in which everything was different. Values were different, language was different, you name it. And first individual I met, and I don't think he'd mind if I said who it was Leo Charles, one of my best friends. And the first thing he said to me, which really brought us together, was he said, "Can you dunk the ball?" And anyone that lives out in rural Alaska, I said to myself, I am in like Flynn, and I'm not kidding you. I was in like Flynn because I just rebounded and passed off those guys. But no, seriously, people have a responsibility, I think, as well. Just like we were talking about intent, I think everybody has a responsibility that when if they hear somebody that is asking a question and the intent is they're not trying to hurt you, but maybe they don't understand, I think you put your arm around the individual and you say, let's go for a walk, let's have something, let's sit down, let's have something to eat, let's have something to drink, and you have that conversation with them. I think that helps that person grow in that experience, helps them understand, and they're not offended, you're not offended, hopefully, and something good comes out of it. But anyone, I mean, I stand in the line at the very briefly, I stand at the line at the supermarket all the time, cars, or Fred Meyer's. And inevitably, there's usually a woman, it's okay, but usually a woman, who will keep looking up and then looking down, looking up, looking down. And just as I'm ready to check out, she'll say, "Can I ask you a question?" And I say, 6, 7. And she's astounded. She thinks I'm clairvoyant. But the point I'm trying to make is I don't turn around and say, "Hey, stop with that macro-aggression on tall people. Leave me alone," and then run out the... I don't do that. Sometimes it's just innocence, and they stumble into something. I think we have a responsibility to help those folks out.
All right. All right. If I could get our student debaters to bring the microphones back up here. We're at a point now where we're going to transition to the third phase of the debate. I know that there are a lot of questions left out there. I would love to be able to give you all the chance to do so, but eventually we have to clear out. I think the Beartooth has an employee party tonight, so they want us gone at some point. Ooh. We're going to move on to the third phase of the debate now. That is the opportunity for each team to give one 5-minute summary speech that captures the best of their position and is their last chance to advance their argument. The tradition in academic debating is that we start with the con side for that speech. We give them the opportunity to close their case, and then because the pro side is charged with defending the motion, with representing this proposal, they get the advantage of having the last word. So, at this point, I would like to invite a member of our con team to the podium to give your 5-minute summary speech in defense of the position that you've been assigned.
I'll just take a moment to speak directly to the motion. Free speech becomes difficult, but you can always think what you want to think. To build on something that Senator Dunleavy just said, we talk about our rights a lot, but we often don't talk about the responsibilities that go along with those rights. And so I think I would sum up by saying, in terms of the motion, that political correctness has not caused a compromise of free thought, but its exaggeration can chill free speech. I think we've agreed on that, and there are ways around that. One of them is respecting one another, having the conversation as we are today, and the thing that I just heard as well is creating relationships. And I think that's vitally important. I like to think about Senator Ted Stevens and Daniel Inouye from Hawaii, right? Complete opposite sides of the fence, but they were able to work together for a common good because they had a relationship.
And, we know, unfortunately, racism, sexism, homophobia, all these other isms still exist in our society and on our campuses, even as our campuses grow diverse. We have an obligation to help the diverse students negotiate this, to prepare them for the real world. One of the things about a university is we are supposed to be the place that is actually preparing young people or returning adults for moving into the next phase of their life. We have an obligation to make sure that we keep both the right and the left from shutting down thoughtful discourse. We have to call out the hypocrisy if we see it from either side. In an increasingly polarized society, the university can be that guide for how we move the dialogue and the way we dialogue forward into a respectful and meaningful conversation. And that's where I believe political correctness can take us, because it's really about calling out the bad behavior. That's not PC. Here's what we need to be doing instead. And so it is about, in a sense, retaking the definition of political correctness to privilege all voices, to give voice in particular to those who haven't had voice before, and to give all of us, including those students who are graduating, the skills to go out in the world and contend for themselves and argue for themselves and push back against people who would shut them down in a productive way.
All right. Our appreciation to the con team. This is the first time, by the way, that I've ever had a con team share the rebuttal speech time. So it's all about inclusion. I know it's important that everyone feels like they're part of the process, so I appreciate that.
Kumbaya.
We're going to turn now to our opposition side. You get the same 5-minute opportunity to close the proposition's position, arguing for the motion. You'll hear a bell at that 1-minute mark. That'll let you know that you got 1 minute left. So, Senator Dunleavy, whenever you're ready.
Can Paul and I share as well, since we're all sharing?
There's no reason why you
Paul,
can't.
just jump in whenever you want. I won't be offended. First of all, again, this has been actually really fun. I wish I could go on for a little longer. The University of Alaska, I think, is somewhat unique, right? A lot of things come from the lower 48 a little later. Certain protests, certain ideas, certain fashions come a little later up here, just by virtue that we're at the top of the world. But there's no doubt, you just have to get on social media. Social media has been a plus for communication. Some people will say it's a minus, but get on social media. Look on the website, The Demands, if you haven't already. It's very fascinating. The fact of the matter is that the concept of political correctness could be as the con side defines it, and I think many of us agree that often it is. But what's happening is across the nation, you've got some really bizarre, dangerous things going on that are changing some of those institutions at their core. You know, it kind of reminds me, if anyone's here is a student of history, and I know that Dan is, if you read a little bit about the French Revolution, it happened about 10 years, just a few years after our revolution. And many of our individuals, Madison, Jefferson, Monroe, anti-federalists, federalists, were watching this thing. And as it started out, the Jeffersonian side of things thought, what a beautiful thing. The people of France are, they've thrown off despotism, they're going to get rid of the king, and they're going to be like us. And then all of a sudden, in a short period of time, you ran into a thing called the Reign of Terror. And our people were just astonished. They were taken back because of what was happening. The thing got out of control. And what's happening with political correctness in this country today is it's spinning out of control. The president has indicated that. Dershowitz has indicated that. Bloomberg and, I don't want to give anyone a heart attack here, but Charles Koch did an editorial not too long ago, both agreeing it's happening. The comedians don't want to go there anymore. There are musicians that don't want to play on campus anymore. You have what I think many of us would consider individuals like Condoleezza Rice, Clarence Thomas, that are not even invited to some of these campuses anymore. So while it may not be happening here, and it may not ever happen here, and I hope it doesn't, because I think universities need to be the temple, the curator of the concept of dialogue and knowledge. Because without that, I think we're going to become less of a country, and I think we're going to become something we really don't want to be. It's like what happened with the French Revolution. I'm not saying we're going to be lopping off heads, but it's down south, it's getting pretty close to violence. It certainly isn't civil. And I think we need to keep an eye on it. And I'm glad to hear that the folks on the con side recognize both the importance of free speech and just the civility that needs to happen. So I'm glad they agree with this. Just vote for us. Let's get this thing over with.
All right, thank you very much, Senator Dunleavy. At this time now, we're going to reopen our polling. And we're going to present a post-debate poll. Now, there is one difference that you will notice about this poll, and that is that as you text your answer in, you won't see the poll update. That's because we're going to keep it secret for just a moment, and then we're going to reveal what the results of that voting were so that nobody gets influenced perhaps by making positional or gamesmanship based upon which is gaining and which is losing. So pull out your cell phones. That number to which you texted is the same. It's the same 37607 number that you sent your first opinion to. The codes up here have changed, but they still correspond with whether at the end of the debate, based upon the arguments you've heard, you now agree with, disagree with, or are still undecided about your position on the motion. We'll give you a chance to do that, and while you're doing that, I'm going to offer a couple of thank yous, and I'm also going to remind you of a couple of things that we have as upcoming events. First of all, in terms of thank yous, I want to say my most absolute and sincere thank you to Senator Dunleavy and Mr. Jenkins for representing the pro side, and to Drs. Klein and Hirshberg for representing the con side. Could you join me one more time in giving them a big round of applause for their efforts here tonight? It's no small thing to stand before a group of 400 people, many of whom you know are going to disagree with you and advocate your position. So I very much appreciate their willingness to contribute to the public discourse surrounding these issues. I also want to say a giant thank you to the Alaska Dispatch News. They partnered with us on this series since the beginning, and they are an outstanding partner for doing so. They help us get the word out about the debates. They provide their resources to capturing these debates on video and making sure others can enjoy this conversation that we've had as well. So we very much appreciate the work that we've done with them and look forward to continuing to present things like this. We also want to say thanks to the Beartooth Theatrepub. They're a terrific venue for things like this and always a great place for our community to gather and talk about things, think about things, and experience a variety of new ways to explore our culture. And finally, I want to say, yeah, absolutely.
Not to mention that.
Finally, I want to say thank you very much to you, to Anchorage, Alaska. Not only because the ticket price that you have paid tonight goes to support the students that we work with through the Seawolf debate program, but for being a community that is committed to contemplating big ideas like this. It's an absolute joy, given my profession, to find a group of like-minded individuals, like I've found here in Anchorage, who are willing to come to these events, to sit down, to think through them, to behave and engage one another civilly, all in the pursuit of understanding their world better. So thank you all very much for who you are, and thanks for supporting these sorts of events. A couple of reminders. I would remind you to check out debatingakfuture.com if you are, or perhaps have connections to, a high school or university student around the state of Alaska. That's a really good opportunity for you to find a way to win $10,000 in scholarship money. That's a terrific contest. You submit a video of you and a partner arguing for and against one of these motions that we have available. If you're selected by popular vote as one of the best representatives of that argument, you're going to get invited to an in-person debating competition in late spring of 2017, hopefully to coincide with the time when our legislature is making some of these decisions. Hint, hint. They have an in-person debating contest arguing about these issues that are related to Alaska's fiscal future. Also remind you to connect with us at seawolfdebate.com. Look for Seawolf Debate on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And of course, we will still have our table available in the lobby on your way out if you would prefer to sign up on a piece of paper to get connected to our email list. We'd be more than happy to have you aboard for that. So I think at this point, we probably had sufficient time for everyone.
Can I sneak in a comment? Can everyone hear me? I want to sneak in one comment.
Oh.
Does everyone know that Steve Johnson coaches one of the best debate teams in the world? In the world. So I would say congratulations to Steve and to the students and the Seawolf debate. I love wearing that out on my friends from Harvard and Oxford. We kicked your butt last time around. UAA, so it's Steve.
Oddly enough, Harvard is not as excited about that as you tend to be. So. At least I find them not so. Okay, let's do this. Let's go back to our pre-debate poll so we can remind ourselves what the audience's sentiment was before the advocates had their crack at you. We had, prior to the debate, 48% of people agreeing with the motion that political correctness has compromised free thought on campus. We had 31% of our voters disagreeing with that, and 21% chose to remain neutral until they'd had a chance to hear the argument. So now let's take a look at our post-debate poll. And we can do our reveal at this point. So obviously, the greatest change in this case was in favor of the opposition or the con side's arguments. I want to say congratulations to Dr. Hirshberg and Klein, but again to say thank you to all